My brother raised his champagne glass at my retirement party, smiled at the room full of people, and said it loud enough for everyone in the back to hear. "To the family failure, 40 years of work and nothing to show for it." Everyone laughed. My niece laughed. My own mother laughed. I lifted my glass with the rest of them and smiled the way I had smiled at 1,000 boardroom tables across 4 decades. What none of them knew was that 6 years earlier, in the spring of 2019, I had quietly purchased the entire distressed debt portfolio from the regional bank that held my brother's mortgage. His house, his second house in Aspen, the boat, all of it. And the foreclosure clock had already started ticking 3 weeks before he made that toast. I am sitting on the back deck this morning with a mug of black coffee, watching a thin gray fog lift off the water beyond the cedars. My name is Marlowe Whitaker. I am 64 years old, a retired senior credit analyst, and I live just outside Bellingham, Washington, on 3 acres my late husband bought for me before he passed. My hair went silver before I turned 50, and my knees protest the stairs in cold weather, but I am still steady. What I want to tell you about is one retirement dinner that turned out to be the beginning of something I had been preparing for, without quite admitting it to myself, for almost a decade. By the time the story is finished, I think you will understand how a single signature on a single document, signed at a kitchen table while no one was looking, can hold more weight than every loud word ever spoken at a family table. I never planned to work in banking. I grew up in a small mill town in eastern Oregon, the middle child of 3 and the only girl. My older brother Bennett was the golden one, tall, broad-shouldered, easy with people in the way that opens doors without him ever having to push. My younger brother Wesley was the quiet one, the kind of boy who took apart radios just to put them back together. And then there was me. The one who read too much, asked too many questions, and brought home report cards no one looked at because Bennett had brought home a football trophy that same week. My mother used to say I was the practical one, which in our family was not a compliment. It meant I was not charming, not athletic, and not destined for anything anyone would brag about at church. I left for college on a scholarship I had to apply for 3 times to get. My father told me at the kitchen table the night before I drove east that I was wasting tuition money the family did not have, even though the scholarship was paying for it. He said it without raising his voice. He said most cruel things without raising his voice. I drove away the next morning in a rusted Datsun with a duffel bag in the back seat and 1 cardboard box of textbooks beside it, and I did not cry until I crossed the state line. I studied finance because numbers did not lie to me, and they did not pick favorites, and they did not laugh at me at family dinners. I took an entry-level position at a regional bank in Seattle 2 weeks after graduation, and I stayed at that bank, in different forms and through different mergers, for the next 38 years. I learned to read a balance sheet the way some people read poetry. I learned that the most important things in any financial document are almost always written in the smallest type, and that the people who sign without reading are the people who lose everything. By the time I was 32, I had been promoted 3 times. By 40, I was managing a small team of analysts who specialized in the kind of work most people in banking never want to do. We reviewed distressed loan portfolios. We looked at mortgages and business notes that had stopped performing, and we figured out what they were really worth, and we recommended whether the bank should hold them, sell them, or restructure them. It is quiet work. It does not get written up in the trade magazines, but it is the work that determines whether a bank survives a downturn or quietly folds into another bank's letterhead, and I was good at it. Not because I was the smartest person in the room, but because I was patient, and I never made a recommendation I had not personally walked through twice. My husband, Daniel, was a high school math teacher. We met at a friend's wedding when I was 28, and he asked me what I did for a living, and when I told him, he said it sounded like detective work for grown-ups. We were married within the year. We never had children. That was not something either of us planned for or against. It simply did not happen, and after a certain point, we stopped talking about it, and we built a life around each other instead. We bought the house in Bellingham in 1998 because Daniel wanted a garden and I wanted quiet, and the property had both. He died of pancreatic cancer in 2014. He was 56. After Daniel was gone, I worked harder, not because I needed the money. He had left me well provided for, and I had been saving and investing my own income carefully for 30 years. I worked harder because the house was too quiet, and because numbers still did not lie to me, even when everything else had. I started taking on consulting projects in addition to my full-time work at the bank. Small contracts at first, then larger ones. Private investors who needed someone to evaluate distressed portfolios they were considering purchasing. boutique firms that handled the kind of acquisitions that never make the front page of the business section. The work paid extraordinarily well, and I did not need any of the money to live on, so I let it accumulate in accounts I rarely looked at. By 2018, those accounts held considerably more than anyone in my family would have believed if I had told them, which I never did. Bennett by then was 63 years old and had been living for almost 3 decades on a reputation he had not actually built. He had inherited my father's small construction company at 35 and run it for 20 years before selling it during the housing peak in 2007. He had walked away with what looked at the time like a small fortune, and he had spent most of the years since then telling anyone who would listen about his business acumen. He had bought the big house in Mercer Island, the vacation property in Aspen, the boat at the Shilshal Marina. He had 3 children who all attended private universities, and a wife named Camilla who wore the kind of jewelry that announced itself across a room. What no one in the family knew, because Bennett would have died before he admitted it, was that the construction company had been struggling for years before he sold it, and that he had sold it not because the market was perfect, which is what he told everyone, but because the company was about to fail and he had received a quiet offer from a competitor who did not yet know how bad the books really were. I knew because I had reviewed his financials in 2009 when he asked me indirectly, through our mother, whether his bank should approve his second mortgage refinance. He never thanked me for the analysis. Bennett's lifestyle in the years after the sale was not built on what he had walked away with. It was built on leverage. He had taken out a substantial mortgage on the Mercer Island house, a second loan against the Aspen property, and a line of credit secured against the marina slip in the boat. He had structured all of it through a single regional bank based in Tacoma, the same bank where I had spent the first 15 years of my career, though I had moved on to a larger institution by the time he opened his accounts there. Bennett did not know I had once worked in that building. He had never asked. He had never asked about my career at all, in any meaningful way, in 40 years of family dinners. The spring of 2019 was when everything quietly came together, though I did not see it as anything dramatic at the time. The Tacoma Bank was being absorbed into a larger holding company, and as part of the merger, they were offloading a portfolio of underperforming loans, distressed paper, the kind of work I had spent my career evaluating. A boutique acquisition firm in Seattle that I had consulted for several times reached out and asked if I would review the package privately, off the books, before they decided whether to bid. They sent over the encrypted file on a Tuesday afternoon. I poured a cup of coffee, sat down at my home office desk, and began reading. The portfolio contained 417 loans across the Pacific Northwest. Residential mortgages, second mortgages, business lines, marine notes, a handful of small commercial properties. I had reviewed thousands of files like it over my career, and I read each one with the same patience I had always brought to the work, taking notes in the small leather notebook I kept beside my desk. I was about 90 minutes in when I came across loan number 204, a primary mortgage on a property in Mercer Island, a second mortgage on a property in Pitkin County, Colorado, a secured note against a vessel docked at Shilshal. The borrower's name was Bennett Hartford Whitaker. I set the notebook down and looked out the window for a long time. The cedars were moving slightly in a soft wind off the bay, and the light was that particular gray gold that comes in late April when the rain is taking a break. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel anything dramatic at all. What I felt, sitting there with my coffee going cold beside the keyboard, was a deep and settled quiet, the kind that comes when something you have been carrying without realizing it suddenly has a shape. I read the file 3 more times. Bennett was 4 months behind on the primary mortgage, 6 months behind on the Aspen loan. The marine note was current, but only because he had been making minimum payments by borrowing against the line of credit secured by the same boat. The bank had already issued a soft notice on the Mercer Island property, which is the kind of letter that does not yet say the word foreclosure, but uses every word adjacent to it. He had about 14 months before the bank would be required, under their own internal policy, to begin formal proceedings, unless the portfolio was sold first, in which case the new owner would inherit the right to set their own timeline. I called the boutique firm back the next morning. I told them I would not be able to consult on the portfolio because I had identified a conflict of interest. They thanked me for my professionalism and asked if I had any other recommendations. I gave them 2 names of colleagues I trusted. Then I hung up the phone and I sat at my desk for another hour and I made a decision. I did not buy the portfolio impulsively. I want to be clear about that because I have thought about it many times since, and I want to say it the way it actually happened. I spent 3 weeks reviewing every loan in that package, not just my brother's, treating it the way I would have treated any acquisition for a paying client. I built spreadsheets. I ran recovery scenarios. I called 2 old colleagues, one in Seattle and one in Denver, and I asked them general questions about regional property valuations without telling them why I was asking. I priced the portfolio at what I believed was its fair distressed value, and then I priced it again at what I would be willing to pay if I were buying it for myself, which is always a different number, because when you are buying for yourself, you are also buying the patience that comes with not having to answer to anyone else. I formed a small holding company in late April. I named it Cedar Point Recovery, after a stretch of coastline Daniel and I had loved. I funded it from one of the consulting accounts I had been quietly building for years, and I retained an attorney in Portland who had no connection to anyone in my family or my professional history in Tacoma. I instructed her to handle all communications with the selling bank under the company's name only. My personal name appeared nowhere in any document the bank or its successor would ever see. The offer was submitted on the first Monday of May. There were 2 other bidders. I knew this because my attorney told me, and because the boutique firm I had declined to consult for was one of them. We won the portfolio at a price that was slightly above what the boutique firm had been willing to pay, and significantly below what the loans would be worth if even a third of them recovered to performing status. The transaction closed on May 23, 2019. The transfer documents were delivered to my attorney's office in a sealed brown envelope on a Friday afternoon, and she forwarded them to my secure inbox before she went home for the weekend. I read every page that night. Daniel had been gone 5 years, and I sat in his old reading chair by the window with the laptop open on my knees, and I read until the light failed. When I closed the laptop, I poured a small glass of the Irish whiskey he used to keep on the shelf, and I sat with it for a long time without drinking it. Then I went to bed. The next morning, I did something I had been thinking about for years without ever quite letting myself plan it. I drove down to Tacoma, parked across the street from the building where the original bank had been headquartered, and I sat in the car for almost an hour, watching the people come and go through the revolving door. It was the same building I had walked into as a 22-year-old in a brown skirt suit with shoes that pinched my feet, carrying a leather portfolio my mother had bought me as a graduation gift, even though she did not approve of the career I was starting. I had been so afraid that morning. I had been certain everyone inside would see immediately that I did not belong there. Sitting in the car 40 years later, I thought about that young woman in the pinching shoes. I thought about all the meetings she had sat through where men twice her age had spoken over her, all the promotions she had earned and watched go to less qualified colleagues, all the years she had absorbed the slow, steady message that she was the practical one, the unremarkable one, the family failure. And I sat in the car and laughed quietly. I did not foreclose on Bennett. I want to say that clearly because if you have followed this story so far, you may have been waiting for me to describe the moment I sent the letter. There was no letter. Not in 2019, not in 2020, not in any of the years that followed. What I did instead was something I had been trained over 40 years to consider before any drastic action, which is that distressed paper is almost always worth more if you give the borrower room to recover than if you accelerate the process and force a sale into a market that may not be ready to absorb it. I assigned the management of the loan to a small servicing company I contracted through Cedar Point Recovery, and I instructed them to continue the existing payment terms without modification. Bennett never knew the loan had changed hands. The monthly statements arrived in his mailbox with a slightly different return address, and that was the only visible difference. What I did watch, very carefully, was his behavior. Because a borrower who is 4 months behind and beginning to dig out is a different animal from a borrower who is 4 months behind and sliding further. I asked the servicing company to send me a quarterly summary, nothing more invasive than what any portfolio manager would request, and I read those summaries the way I had read every credit file of my career, looking for the patterns underneath the numbers. By the end of 2019, Bennett had brought the Mercer Island mortgage current. By the spring of 2020, he was even on the Aspen property. The pandemic complicated things briefly, but he held steady. I assumed at the time that he had finally tightened his spending, that perhaps the close call with the Tacoma bank had frightened him into discipline. I was wrong about that, but I would not learn how wrong for several more years. In the meantime, the family went on the way the family had always gone on. My mother turned 90 in 2020, and we held a small, distanced gathering in her backyard in Salem. Bennett gave a toast in which he called himself the family patriarch, even though our father had been dead for 16 years and the title had never actually been offered. I sat in a folding chair near the back with a paper plate of potato salad and a plastic cup of lemonade, and I clapped politely along with everyone else. Wesley, my younger brother, sat beside me. He leaned over at one point and said quietly that he had stopped listening to Bennett's toasts somewhere around 2003, and I laughed into my lemonade and almost choked. Wesley was the only person in the family who had ever asked me about my work in a way that suggested he wanted to know the answer. He was a high school physics teacher in Eugene, divorced, no children, and he and I had drifted closer in the years after Daniel died. We spoke on the phone every Sunday evening for about half an hour. He never asked for money. He never complained about Bennett, though he had as much reason as I did. He simply called, and we talked about books and weather and the slow daily texture of two lives that had landed in places no one in our family had predicted. I never told Wesley about Cedar Point Recovery, not because I did not trust him. I trusted him completely. I did not tell him because the knowledge would have been a burden to him, and he had carried enough quiet burdens already. I kept the holding company, the loans, the entire arrangement, locked behind a door in my own mind that I opened only when the quarterly summaries arrived. The rest of the time, I lived my life. The retirement decision came slowly. I had been with my last bank for almost 20 years by 2024, and I had been senior enough for the last decade that no one looked over my shoulder anymore. The work was still interesting in the way that any work you have mastered remains interesting. But I had begun to notice that I was reading the same kinds of files I had been reading for 3 decades and finding the same patterns inside them. There is a moment in any long career when you realize that what you have left to teach is more valuable than what you have left to learn, and I had reached that moment without quite noticing it arrive. I gave the bank 12 months of notice in the spring of 2024. They were generous about it. The retirement was scheduled for late September of 2025. My sister-in-law Camilla planned the party, which I had not asked for and would have politely declined if I had been consulted. The invitation came in the mail in early August on heavy cream cardstock with my name in a calligraphic script that suggested the party was less about me than about whoever Camilla wanted to impress. The venue was a private dining room at a country club outside Bellevue. Cocktails at 6, dinner at 7, toasts at 8. Dress code listed as cocktail attire, which in Camilla's vocabulary meant something different from what it meant for ordinary people. I held the invitation in my kitchen for a long minute and thought about the simplest way to say no. Then I thought about my mother, who was now 95 and frail and would want to be there, and I set the invitation on the counter and let it stay. 3 weeks before the party, the quarterly summary from the servicing company arrived in my secure inbox. I opened it on a Thursday morning with my coffee, and the first line stopped me cold. Bennett had missed the August payment on the Mercer Island mortgage. He had also missed the July payment, which the servicing company had categorized as a minor delay and not flagged in the previous summary. 2 payments behind with a third due in 11 days. The Aspen property was current, but only barely. The marine note had been refinanced in the spring through a different lender entirely, which meant Bennett had been quietly moving collateral around, the way borrowers do when they are trying to outrun something they have not yet named to themselves. I made some calls that afternoon, not to the servicing company. I had access to other tools by then, including discrete research professionals I had used on past consulting assignments, the kind who can construct a clear picture of a person's financial situation from publicly available filings, court records, and the patterns of small transactions that ordinary people never think about. I asked for a complete picture of Bennett's current position. I told my contact there was no hurry and no specific deadline. The report arrived in fragments over the next 2 weeks. Bennett had been losing money steadily for almost 4 years. The consulting business he had started after selling the construction company had collapsed quietly in 2022. Camilla's spending had not adjusted. The 3 adult children had each been receiving regular financial support that none of them appeared to know was unsustainable. There was a private school tuition for a grandchild that had been paid late twice in the last year. There were 2 credit card balances over $40,000 each, and there was something I had not expected. Bennett had recently taken out a third mortgage against the Mercer Island property through a private lender at an interest rate that suggested he had not had any other options. The closing date on that third mortgage was August 14, 2025. 6 weeks before the retirement party, I read the full report twice, made myself a fresh cup of coffee, and walked out to the back deck. The light over the bay that afternoon was the same gray-gold light I had been looking at on the day in April of 2019 when I first opened the encrypted file and saw Bennett's name on loan number 204. 6.5 years had passed. I was 64 now instead of 58. My hair was a shade lighter. My knees were a little worse. But the quiet that came over me sitting on the deck that afternoon was the same quiet I had felt then, the deep, settled kind, like something inside me was lining up with something outside me, and I did not need to force it. I made one decision that afternoon, and I made it cleanly. I would attend the retirement party. I would let Camilla seat me wherever she wanted. I would smile at the cousins I had not seen in 3 years and accept the small wrapped gift my mother would press into my hands with her trembling fingers. I would not say a word about what I knew. I would not mention Cedar Point Recovery. I would not mention the loans. I would let the evening unfold exactly the way Camilla had planned it, and I would watch. The party was on a Saturday in late September. I drove down to Bellevue in the late afternoon in the small silver sedan I had bought after Daniel passed, the one with the good heated seats I had stopped feeling guilty about. I wore a charcoal silk blouse, dark trousers, and a single string of pearls Daniel had given me on our 20th anniversary. I parked in the country club lot, sat in the car for 2 minutes with the engine off, and then I went inside. The room was beautiful in the careful, slightly impersonal way that country clubs are always beautiful. White linen, low candles, a small string quartet playing something restrained in the corner. About 40 people were there by the time I arrived. Bennett saw me before I saw him. He crossed the room with his arms wide and called me his little sister, and he kissed me on the cheek in front of 3 people who turned to watch, and he said how proud he was to see me reach this milestone. I let him do it. I returned the kiss politely. I thanked him for coming. My mother was seated near the windows in a wheelchair with Wesley beside her holding her hand. I went to her first. She looked smaller than she had in the spring. Her eyes were still clear. She held my face in both her hands for a moment and told me she had always known I would do well, which was not true, but I did not correct her. I sat with her through the cocktail hour and let her tell me a story about a neighbor's cat she had already told me twice on the phone. Dinner began at 7. I was seated at the head table between Bennett and Camilla, which I had expected, and across from a couple I did not recognize who turned out to be Camilla's friends from her tennis club. The food was elegant and forgettable. Bennett dominated the conversation in the way he always dominated conversation, telling stories about himself with the practiced ease of a man who has been telling those same stories for 30 years and has stopped noticing whether anyone is listening. I listened. I always listen. It is one of the things I had learned was most underestimated in a room, and one of the reasons I had been good at my job. At 8 o'clock exactly, the country club manager dimmed the lights slightly, and Bennett stood up to give his toast. Bennett held his champagne glass at chest height and smiled the way he had smiled at every family event I could remember, the easy practice smile of a man who had never once been seriously contradicted in a room of people who loved him. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about how time flies. He made a joke about my age that landed with a polite, scattered laugh. And then he raised the glass higher and he said it. To my sister Marlowe, to the family failure. 40 years of work and nothing to show for it. He laughed first to give the room permission, and the room laughed. Camilla laughed. The tennis club couple laughed. My niece Brielle, who was 26 and should have known better, laughed loudest of all. My mother did not laugh. Wesley did not laugh. Wesley was looking down at his plate with his jaw set in a way I had not seen since we were teenagers. I lifted my own glass. I smiled. I took a small sip of the champagne, and I set the glass back down on the white linen, and I said, gently and without raising my voice, that I was grateful to my brother for the toast and grateful to everyone for coming, and that I hoped the rest of the evening would be a pleasure. The room applauded politely. Bennett sat back down, satisfied, and turned to Camilla to ask whether the dessert was coming soon. I do not remember much of the rest of the dinner. I remember Wesley standing up at one point and walking outside to the terrace and standing there for a long time with his hands in his pockets. I remember my mother reaching across the table and putting her thin, papery hand over mine and holding it there for almost a full minute without saying anything. I remember that I did not cry. I had not cried in a long time, and that night was not going to be the night I started. The party ended at 10. I drove home with the windows cracked because the night was clear and I wanted to smell the salt off the bay. I went to bed at midnight. I slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally set part of it down. The foreclosure letter went out 3 weeks later. I want to be precise about what I did and did not do because I have been precise about everything else in this story, and I will not change my method now. I did not personally instruct the servicing company to initiate foreclosure proceedings on the Mercer Island mortgage. What I did was decline, at the regular quarterly review meeting with the servicing company, to grant the discretionary forbearance extension that I had been granting Bennett quietly for the previous 6 years. I simply did not grant it. I did not have to say anything more. The servicing company followed its own standard protocols, which required that a borrower 3 payments behind, without an active forbearance arrangement, be sent the formal notice of default. The letter was generated by their automated system on a Tuesday morning and mailed the same afternoon. I did not see it. I did not need to see it. I knew what it said. Bennett received it on a Thursday. Camilla opened it first because she opened all the mail, and she called him at his office, and she read it aloud to him on the speakerphone in a voice that, according to what Wesley later told me, broke twice before she reached the bottom of the page. The lender's name on the letter was Cedar Point Recovery, LLC. Bennett had never heard of Cedar Point Recovery. Neither had Camilla. The call came on a Saturday morning, almost exactly 2 months after the retirement party. I was in the kitchen, slicing a pear for my breakfast, when the phone rang. It was Bennett's number. I let it ring 3 times before I picked it up, not out of any strategy, but because I wanted to finish the pear first and set the knife down where it belonged. When I answered, I said hello in the same voice I used for every phone call, which is the same voice I had used at every family dinner for 40 years, the calm, even voice of the practical one. Bennett was crying. I had never heard my brother cry in my life. Not as a child, not at our father's funeral, not at the small, distanced memorial we had held in 2014 when Daniel passed. He was crying now, in the wet, broken way that people cry when they have been holding it back for several days and finally cannot anymore. He said my name twice before he could get any other words out. Then he said in pieces that he was in trouble, that the bank had sent a letter, that they were going to foreclose on the Mercer Island house, and that he did not know what to do, and that he was sorry to be calling me, and that he did not know who else to call. I let him talk. I let him talk for almost 10 minutes without interrupting once, because I had learned a long time ago that the most important thing you can give someone who is collapsing is space to finish the sentence they are trying to say. He told me about the failed consulting business, which I already knew. He told me about Camilla's spending, which I already knew. He told me about the 3rd mortgage in August, which I already knew. He told me he had been hiding all of it from everyone in the family for 4 years. He said he had been ashamed. He said the toast at my retirement party had been about his own fear, not about me, and that he had known it was cruel even as he was saying the words, and he had not been able to stop himself. He said he was sorry. When he ran out of things to say, there was a long silence on the line. I could hear him breathing. I could hear Camilla somewhere in the background, asking him quietly what I had said. He told her with his hand half covering the phone that I had not said anything yet. Then he asked me, in a small voice I had not heard from him since we were both children in the house in eastern Oregon, whether I knew anyone at all from my years in banking, who might be able to help him. He said the lender's name on the letter was a company he had never heard of, Cedar Point Recovery, and that he had tried to look them up online and could not find a website or a phone number, only a registered address in Portland and an attorney's name. He said the attorney would not return his calls. He said he was running out of time. I held the phone for a moment. The pear was still sitting on the cutting board in front of me, 2 slices already cut, the rest of the fruit waiting. I looked at it, then I looked out the kitchen window at the cedars, and I said gently that yes, I did know the company. I said it because I am not and have never been a liar. There was a long silence. I could hear Bennett breathing on the other end of the line, faster now and then slower and then almost not at all. Marlowe, he said. How do you know them? I told him the truth. I told him I had purchased the portfolio that contained his loans in May of 2019, that I had held those loans quietly for 6.5 years, that I had granted him forbearance every quarter during that time without his knowledge, and that I had chosen not to grant it this quarter. I told him I had not done any of it to destroy him. I told him I had done it because the loans had come across my desk, and because I had been trained for 40 years to take care of distressed paper that other people had walked away from, and because I had not known, in 2019, what I was going to do with the knowledge, only that I could not let the file go to anyone else. I told him the name of the company was Cedar Point Recovery because Daniel and I had walked that coastline together the spring before he was diagnosed, and that I had wanted something of him in the name, even if no one else would ever know. Bennett was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, he asked me one question. He asked me why I had granted the forbearance for 6 years. He asked me why, if I had been angry, I had not foreclosed in 2019 when I could have, when no one would have stopped me. I told him I had not been angry. I told him I had been waiting. I told him that what I had been waiting for was the moment when he would have to ask me in his own voice, without performance, for help. I told him that moment had taken longer than I expected, and that I was sorry for both of us that it had taken the form it did. We talked for another hour. He cried more and I let him. We worked out between us a path forward. I would withdraw the foreclosure notice on the Mercer Island property. I would restructure his loans through Cedar Point Recovery on terms he could actually carry, which would require him to sell the Aspen property and the boat. Camilla would have to find work, and the adult children would have to begin supporting themselves. None of it was punishment. All of it was arithmetic. He agreed to every term before I finished describing it. The Aspen property sold in March. The boat sold in May. Camilla, to my genuine surprise, took a position managing a small art gallery in Bellevue and discovered she was good at it. Bennett began attending a weekly support group for men in late-life financial crisis, which he had found on his own without telling anyone, and which Wesley discovered only because he ran into Bennett coming out of the meeting one Tuesday evening. Wesley called me afterward and we talked for 2 hours. My mother passed in February of 2026 peacefully at 96. Bennett and I stood on either side of her bed and held her hands together at the end. He had not been a different brother to me overnight. He was still Bennett, with all the habits a man builds across 65 years. But he had stopped giving toasts. He had stopped telling stories about himself in rooms where no one was listening. And he had begun in small, careful ways to ask me questions about my life. I am 65 now. My hands are steady. My knees still protest. The cedars still move in the wind off the bay every morning when I take my coffee out to the deck. I spent 40 years being called the practical one, the unremarkable one, the family failure. I know now that those were never the things I was. They were only the things other people needed me to be so they would not have to look at themselves too closely. The numbers never lied to me, and in the end, they did not lie to anyone else either.